Hello everyone and welcome to another Egeria webinar. Today we're going to talk about sustainability and how to use Egeria to create a sustainability initiative. As we started putting the material together, we realized that there was way too much for a single hour, so we divided it into two parts. And today we're going to focus on understanding what's involved in a sustainability initiative and talking about what Egeria can do for you at a very high level. And then the next part of this, which we'll do in a month or so, will actually walk you through the different APIs and show the metadata in Egeria and how you use it. So I'm Mandy Chessel, who's talking now, and I also have a co-presenter, Dan Wolfson, who is also going to do a lot of the presenting. Dan, do you want to say hello?
Hello.
Hi.
And welcome to our little show.
Thank you. Okay, so let's get going. To advance the charts, Dan. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Okay, so if you've never heard of Egeria, Egeria is a metadata service. It's a distributed metadata service that also includes a lot of additional function for managing both data and metadata. So we call it an open metadata and governance capability. And the purpose of it has a very broad set of types, and the ability to store a very broad range of information, is to now allow the sharing of knowledge between people and processes, irrespective of the tools and technologies they use. So it's not about, you move everything onto Egeria and then everything works. It's that Egeria will connect into the tools and technologies that you currently have, and then become the backbone, the internet of metadata, or however you want to think about it. It's really sort of moving and validating and exchanging metadata between different tools. And the purpose of this is that often when you're doing something substantial, something transformative in the organization, the existing structure of your organization is aligned with your current mode of operating, and the change requires much more of a horizontal collaboration between people who were traditionally in different teams. And Egeria helps that. It doesn't require everybody to change the way they're working. It just enhances that way by providing additional information. So by breaking down the silos, increasing the ability for people to collaborate is the key value that we're offering here. Next chart. So Dan.
Sure. So for those of you that have been following the Egeria community, you'll all be familiar with the sample company that we use, which is Coco Pharmaceuticals, and we'll talk about that in great detail in a minute. But they are a pharmaceutical company, and the pharmaceutical industry itself is under tremendous pressure to improve its sustainability. They're quite a significant contributor to carbon emissions. In fact, by some measures, they produce more carbon emissions than the auto industry does. And so there's emerging sets of regulatory, financial, and market forces that are driving the need for the pharmaceutical industry to disclose what carbon emissions they are producing and reducing them, setting goals to make those reductions over time. And so even though it's a small company, Coco Pharmaceuticals recognizes that they need to embrace this sustainability challenge. Even before some of the regulations that are coming into play, such as the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive from the EU, even before they are required to do that reporting, they know that it's going to take quite a long time for them to gear up and, in fact, change the corporate culture in order to support the sustainability initiatives. What you can see on the right are just some of the very recent headlines that are coming out either from the World Economic Forum or from a number of other sources talking about the importance of the pharmaceutical industry in the world meeting their sustainability challenges. So over to you, Mandy, to talk about Coco.
Okay, so often when we're doing these types of walkthroughs, we focus very much on individual roles and responsibilities within an organization. And so in Coco Pharmaceuticals, we are focusing on Tom Talley, and she's a recent graduate with ambitions to become a director. So she's really keen to try new things, and Coco Pharmaceuticals is helping her in that challenge. And so they've given her this stretch assignment to lead the new sustainability initiative. So she's been given this huge piece of work to do. Her background is in accounts, so she has a lot of knowledge of the financial side of this, which is a key part of it. It's one of the things that really drives a lot of sustainability initiatives, but she doesn't know an awful lot about pharmaceuticals and that other aspect. So if we go to the next chart, so rather than just sort of dropping her in it, they've actually given her two co-leads who have a lot more experience. So Erin Overview is an information architect. In fact, she leads most of the data governance work, particularly around the technologies and things. So she's very experienced in the types of data they work with. She's worked with the company for a while. And then Stu Faster is a new member of the team, but he leads manufacturing. So he's very experienced in manufacturing and also the automation around it. So although he's a new face to Coco Pharmaceuticals, he has a lot of experience in one of their key operational areas. Okay. Next up, please. Okay, so we have three leaders, and when we think about what are we trying to do, so when we look at sustainability, the reality is we have to make this sustainable. So it's not just a one-time thing. The company sort of goes, hey, look, we're now sustainable, and that's it. It's actually a journey. It's an ongoing it's an ongoing focus. So what the team need to do is to make the appropriate changes to the organization and the technology and the reporting so that there is this continuous improvement and focus on sustainability while they're still running the business. They're not going to stop the business and redo everything. It's all got to be a process of gradual changes as the sustainability initiative grows in strength. So we're going to talk about the types of things that you need to do in a sustainability initiative. And then, as I say, in part 2 of the webinar, we'll show it in action through Egeria. One of the things to understand, we talk about Coco Pharmaceuticals as quite a small company, and compared to the very large pharmaceuticals it is, but it's not simple. It actually does have a distributed operation that spans Canada, United States, UK, Europe, UK and Europe, and they are going through a business transformation, moving from traditional generic pharmaceuticals to more personalized medicine. And so they've bought 2 new factories as well, so both in Austin and in Bucharest. So they had quite a centralized operation, but now they're bringing in these 2 new acquisitions. They have additional challenges to bring that part of the business into their operations. But in addition to the factories, they obviously have warehouses and distributions for their products. They have the research labs that have a lot of interesting chemicals and activity going on there, plus their offices. They've got people traveling around between the sites and to customers. So it's a fairly active business that's going on there. Is this you or me, Dan? I can't remember.
Yep, I think it's me.
Yeah.
So how does an organization become more sustainable? Well, first of all, you need to understand the different sources of carbon emissions across all the different types of facilities that Mandy was talking about, and across all the different sites. And there are different factors that have to be brought into play, and we'll talk a little bit about that are geographical with some of the ways that you calculate your carbon emissions, as well as the different kinds of sources that you might have from different facilities. And we'll again talk about that But in the broad lens, we think about both direct emissions, so things that you're producing directly, such as when you're running transportation and you're running a car or truck, versus things that are indirect, for example, when you're pulling in power from an electrical grid. And so in the case of an electrical grid, you're not producing that carbon emissions directly, but the utility is actually producing those carbon emissions on your behalf. And so that's why it's called indirect. And so we need to focus on how an organization such as Coco Pharmaceuticals uses all of its resources, both the physical resources that they have within their manufacturing plants and labs, but also their human resources and their money, so that they can reduce the waste. They can, as they work with their suppliers, they can make sure that their suppliers themselves are also improving their sustainability footprint, their carbon emissions footprint, as well as those things that Coco Pharmaceuticals can directly control through their own emissions and their own production. And so you need to establish a realistic set of targets, improvement targets, and a program to handle that. When we talk about these targets, you'll hear a term called science-based sustainability targets, meaning that you want to ground those targets not in just wishful thinking, but in a much more realistic, grounded fashion that's much more achievable and measurable. And so what they need to do is they need to be able to monitor the emissions, the different resources, their business practices, understand both where they are today and then where the opportunities might be for improvement over time. They need to apply the culture of innovation that they have as a science-based company doing leading edge research and take a lot of that same culture of innovation and apply it to thinking through how they can reduce some of their carbon footprint, how they can improve their operations, their processes, maybe even some of the chemicals that they choose to use in how they do their experimentation and production. And then they need to establish an ongoing cycle of reporting and evaluating on their success. When we talk about carbon reporting, you often will see it carbon emissions reports produced for a company on a yearly basis. And we can talk more about why that is. But in between, there's interim reporting that you want to do that's looking for changes and looking for new opportunities to reduce emissions as you go through the course of the year. So with all that in mind, Egeria can help us with all of that and really help us with this overall sustainability journey. Egeria supports and accelerates this journey by providing the mechanisms that help us to establish the overall scope and mission of the sustainability program, help us to survey what the available data and the processes are so that we can then begin to build up the analytics and the reporting pipelines that are going to actually compute the greenhouse gas emissions, and then help us to then validate and review the results. And along the way, there's different kinds of artifacts that Egeria can be capturing. There's different kinds of processing that Egeria can coordinate. There's different markings that we can do on the data and the processes and the other assets, indicating what the certifications are for the data, help us to understand this overall pipeline, help us integrate the people as well as the processes. And so Egeria can help us throughout this entire journey as we go through here. And again, we have to remember this is an iterative journey. We're continually learning more. We're building up our knowledge. We're taking everything that we learn on one step and trying to apply that to the next step. And Egeria really ends up being the source of a lot of that information. And so, Mandy, you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so one of the ways to think about Egeria is, although it's distributed, it's maintaining a virtual graph across all of the different tools and repositories that it's integrating, and this becomes very important because there's definitely a mechanical, technical part of managing the data and building reports and things. But there are so many new terms and ways of thinking and approaches that people need to become familiar with, that Egeria, we think of Egeria not just as a metadata repository, but really as the knowledge graph that's helping people learn and grow, understand, and think differently as the sustainability initiative matures. So when we think about Egeria itself, I mean, we talked about the sort of the mechanisms, as we say, you know, the ability to collect this information and help with the data management. But actually what's going on behind the scenes is this people size, because without the people, this isn't going to work. There's nothing, you can't sort of do a sustainability initiative behind the scenes and you know, and just sort of, you have to change the way that people work. And so we see there are sort of 4 parallel tracks that are going on, and the knowledge within Egeria is helping with each of those. So collaboration and feedback, you've got different people working together across the organization, trying to make appropriate change. And so the ability to provide things like likes and ratings and notes and extra information that's presented in the context of a particular piece of processing or a particular activity within the organization. And then, of course, we're building knowledge. We're building knowledge of the requirements, the way that the organization operates, the changes that are occurring, and the value that's delivered. So again, knowledge building is a key track that's going on, and community building. You want people to work together, to feel motivated, to feel a part of something important, and that will engage them both mentally and emotionally into the organization. And finally, of course, you want to change the way that the organization works. So you want different ways of reporting, rewarding people, giving people different roles, and also acting on the insights, the knowledge building that's going on to change the way that people work. So you know, there's a lot going on here, and Egeria does provide this knowledge base behind all your work, but on its own, that's not going to solve it. You do actually need to be thinking about how this knowledge is integrated into the tools that people use every day. You actually need funding, so you need people to be given time and the resources that they need. Senior management needs to be actively engaged so that people feel that, you know, that this is something that the company thinks is extremely important. People have to see it as a way to build their career, and also it's very important that opportunities to celebrate success are taken up at every opportunity.
Is that all of the standards that for reporting and understanding around the greenhouse gas emissions really go back to the greenhouse gas protocol that was defined more than 20 years ago, and it continues to evolve. And so it's important to understand how the greenhouse gas protocol works and how we do accounting and computation for greenhouse gas emissions. And so in the greenhouse gas protocol, it talks about 3 scopes of emissions. There's scope 1, which are gas emissions from direct sources. So things that are, in this particular case, it talks about a federal agency, but things that are coming from the organization itself. They could be stationary sources, such as manufacturing equipment that is driven by diesel, for instance. It could be vehicles and how much fuel is consumed as the vehicles drive. It could be also what we call gas leakage, or from things such as refrigerants. And so which is called fugitive gas emissions. And so there's a number of different kinds of ways in which the scope 1 emissions could manifest. Scope 2 are the indirect emissions, and they come really primarily through the use of the electrical grid. And it does get a little bit more complicated because there's some accounting tricks and some other things that people can do to offset the emissions that utilities produce when, especially coal-powered plants or gas-powered plants. But in general, it's really the purchased electricity that you're consuming, and then we can calculate from that using the greenhouse gas protocol how much gas is being emitted from that. Greenhouse gas is being emitted. Scope 3 is the newest and perhaps the most problematic one to calculate. And in Scope 3, these are about sources that are not directly owned by the company or controlled by the company or the organization. And so we talk about upstream and downstream sources. In fact, there's 15 different categories of sources. And so you can almost think about this as the supply chain. And so when you if you're Coco Pharmaceuticals and you're purchasing chemicals to use in the manufacture of pharmaceuticals, then the actual production of those chemicals would be part of, and the cost of that from a sustainability perspective would be part of your Scope 3. And when you ship those downstream and it goes through some third-party shipper to ship your product out to your customers, again, that would be part of it. That would be a Scope 3 downstream effect. And so Scope 3 is very, very important, but it's also exceptionally difficult to measure accurately and measured in a way that doesn't double count the costs. And so people are working through how to do this in a reasonable way. One area that people have agreed is a good place to start is by looking at things such as employee travel, and so and commuting, and that's a fairly clear-cut form of Scope 3 emissions. And so that's in fact what you'll see is that Coco Pharmaceuticals is starting to experiment there. So I'll turn it back over to you, man. Oh, I guess I'll talk about this next one. So as Coco Pharmaceuticals looks to build out their greenhouse gas inventory, then the question is, well, what do they need? So there, as you can see, there's Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 kinds of activity data that we're going to need to capture. From Scope 1, there's stationary combustion, and so we need things such as the fuel types and the amount of fuel. And common source information can be found or from manufacturing control systems, from inline meters and sensors, from inventory systems, sometimes from financial systems and purchasing systems as well. You also see that we need certain kinds of reference data, and that reference data is actually used in the calculation itself. And many of the sources of this reference data come from government or scientific sources and are used throughout the world, but they can be geographically specific. So some of the reference data that you'll see that we use for one country and the emissions produced in, let's say, the US may be different than what we might use in, let's say, the United Kingdom. And so we need to understand where the reference data, what the reference data needs are, where it's coming from, and also make sure that we get the most current version of the reference data because it does get updated on a periodic basis. So for stationary combustion, we have things like fuel emissions factors and customs emissions factors that could be coming into play. For mobile combustion, we have things like vehicle type, distance, and fuel type, or we could use fuel type and amount. And again, that could be coming from inventory systems, billing and purchasing, vehicle logs, and so forth. And it has similar kinds of reference data requirements. Fugitive gas emissions, most of that from a Coco Pharmaceuticals perspective is really going to be coming from the refrigeration and cooling systems. both air conditioners as well as freezers and refrigerators that they have in both manufacturing and the research lab environment. And so here we need to keep track of what kind of gases are being used, how much volume is leaking. As an interesting fact, if we're in the supermarket, looking at the supermarket world for a minute, a typical supermarket loses more than a quarter of its refrigerant every year. And so all of that is just refrigerant that's escaping into the atmosphere. And so this is a very real concern. And in fact, there's particular laws and regulations monitoring that. That's called the Montreal Protocols. And so for Coco Pharmaceuticals, this is one of the areas that we'll see that they can pay particular attention to and make some real progress on. And so here the common sources of information are inventory systems, purchasing, inline meters, and so forth. And you look at one of the key reference data is called global warming potential. So for the critical kinds of CFCs, carbon fluorocarbons, that they use, there's a global warming potential that can be derived for each of the different kinds of chemicals. On the electric utilities, when we get into scope 2 now we're looking at purchased electricity and the location or market that they're in, and we can be looking at utility bills, local meters, and again, there's a number of other reference data. And for employee travel, we can say, are they flying? Are they taking the train? How far? And we can use that information again with some reference data that we have in order to compute that kind of scope 3 emissions. So once we find the data, or as we go and look for the data in Coco Pharmaceuticals, we find that there already is a bunch of data that they had because they had built a operational data store in the previous year, and they were able to find that and able to find things such as electricity usage and some customer travel information, as well as some indicators of mobile combustion. And they also found some of the reference data sources that they needed. And again, all of these sets of information can be cataloged and we can analyze it with, from a metadata perspective with Egeria itself. Once we found these sources of data, now we can start to plug them into a calculator. And for Coco Pharmaceuticals, the first thing that they do for the first pass of this is to use a calculator that's provided by the greenhouse gas protocol itself, which is an Excel spreadsheet that really does all the computation for you and simplifies the whole job of computing the greenhouse gases and the emissions that you have. And you can also compare it year on year within the spreadsheet. And this calculator does get updated with new reference data. And so it's a great place to start. The downside of the calculator is that it's not automated. It's a much more manual process. So the first time through, using the calculator makes a lot of sense. As you start to learn how all the computations are done, downstream, you're going to want to look at how do you automate more of this and turn it into a more automatic process. So from that calculator, we can then create a dashboard. We can take the results from the calculator, push them back into a database. In this case, it's called Coco Sus, and then create a dashboard that talks about the different kinds of emissions that, in fact, were generated that we were able to compute. And so we can start to see this. And let me switch over to a more live view. This is a live view of the dashboard. And we can see that this is a dashboard. It's built in an open source tool called Superset. And we can see both the scope 1, 2, and 3, and we can start to look at the total emissions for Coco Pharmaceutical over the years, and we can see that it's growing. And if we just looked at this number, you might say, well, that's not necessarily good news because it continues to grow. But the reality is that Coco Pharmaceuticals business is also growing rapidly. And so one of the important things to keep in mind as we think about ability is not just the total amount of emissions that are being produced, but how efficiently the company is in their carbon usage. So there's another measure, and we'll probably talk about in the subsequent webinar, which is really looking at the efficiency of the emissions per the revenue or the production that is taking place. And so so that's an important little distinction here. And we can also look at this per country and see that, in fact, the US has been growing a lot. The Canada just came on board. And so these pictures actually tell a story of Coco Pharmaceuticals' expansion and growth. And so that's an interesting thing and something that we have to factor as we try to understand what's going on here. We can look at this, as we look at this per scope, we can start to see what's going on in scope 1 and scope 2. And we can see that here that scope 2, the electricity consumption, is much bigger than the direct emissions. And again, that's a good indication. We see that the direct emissions did grow because their manufacturing capacity grew, and the equipment in the factories, they have more equipment and there's more production, and therefore there's going to be more emissions. And so that's growing here, and we can watch that grow. And we can also look at the percentage of emissions and just start to see that, in fact, the scope 2 emissions, the electricity is actually growing, taking more of a role. And that also suggests that if they choose some more sustainable forms of electricity production, that they could reduce their overall emissions. And so as we look at scope 1 and dig into it more, we can see that we're overwhelmed by the transportation costs. And again, that tells us starts to tell us and hint to us where there are going to be opportunities to make improvements. And so really the main point about these graphs is to say, well, what stories do they tell us? And how do we start to think about this so that we can look for opportunities for improvement? We can look at more of the site-based emissions and compare how one site does against another site by one kind of operation against another kind of operation, and what's taking place and what's happening in manufacturing versus what's happening in research. And start to look at the stories, look at the numbers, look at the trends, and start to think through what observations can we derive. The labs, not all the labs are similar. Not only are they different in size, but they might have different profiles in how they're emitting carbon, what their sustainability footprint is. And so that might mean that one lab has best practices that can be shared with another lab. Same thing with factories. Not all the factories are the same. One manufacturing site might be able to share best practices with another. And so there's always opportunities, and this is why we do this, in order to really understand how we can start to make improvements. This is looking at emission sources per sites per year, and then we can look at business travel, which they're just starting out with. They just have a few different sellers, and they're looking at it from a salesperson perspective, looking at how much travel they're doing, and therefore how much of that travel, especially by airplane, they're going to be causing for scope 3 emissions. Clearly, air travel is more expensive than rail travel. And so almost we'll see a much more air travel in the US than we would, for example, in Europe. So the main point is that by doing this dashboarding based upon the greenhouse gas calculations, we can really start to better understand what's happening across the organizations and where the opportunities might be for making improvements. And really that's one of the reasons to do this, and then to iterate through this, using Egeria to help us understand this, to keep track of this, to help us to understand what the journey is and manage that overall journey. So this was just an initial accounting that Coco Pharmaceuticals did based on the initial data they could find. They didn't find all the data on this first step. They took what data they could find, they ran it through the calculator, they did the dashboarding around that, and now they can start to ask questions and start to look for where there are opportunities. And so it's an ongoing process, continue to look for more data from procurement and manufacturing, from sensors, continue to refine it. So there's a lot of work to do, but we can already start to see where there's room for improvement and where we can start to try to attack the problem. And most importantly, we're starting to develop awareness across the company and a sustainability culture. Mandy, do you want to pick it up from here?
Yeah, sure. So there's a lot of things going on here. I mean, Dan's showing you business data effectively that is being funneled through a new greenhouse gas data pipeline into Coco SAS, which is a new database to give you, that's accumulating all the data and will allow them to do comparisons across different levels. This type of view, this is a view that we call the information supply chain view. It's a high-level business view of what's going on inside the systems, and it's underpinned by detailed lineage that Egeria is managing based on the data movements that are going through the organization. So when we look at the different granularity of lineage or the information supply chains, it helps to give people confidence that the information they're looking at on the dashboard is correct. It is coming from the right systems. Nobody's making this up. And so it is worthy of taking action based on what you can see. Now, the other aspect, oops, sorry, too fast. The other aspect of this is that this is just one of the information supply chains, but all over the company, data is shifting around, and Egeria's lineage and information supply chain visibility helps the organization look at how their IT systems are operating, because IT systems are also another major source of emissions because they use a lot of power. And many organizations just keep adding systems. They very rarely remove a system. And so as the company gets older, it tends to have a larger IT estate. And then it sort of tries to shuffle the data between them. And you end up with, as I say, very large and complex IT environments. So here we're showing a supply chain just for this particular dashboard, but another aspect of how Egeria can help in sustainability initiatives is in the rationalization, simplification of the IT systems and the way that data is flowing between them in order to reduce the use of electricity in the organization. I've finished now. We can go on to the next one. So we also talked about how important it is to get people engaged. If you think about it, any change in an organization can be quite alarming for many employees because they worry that the change will leave them without a role or with less influence. And so often you can get resistance to change in these organizations because of fear. And so thinking about people's motivation and their feeling towards the initiative is a key part of success. So here we're highlighting an example where they decide that the emission of cooling chemicals is actually a serious problem, but it's something that they can do something about. They don't need to have cooling systems that use CFCs, and so they say, well, okay, this is something, it's easy to measure, we can tackle this. Let's focus on this initial initiative of saying, let's get rid of all of our refrigeration and cooling units that contain CFCs. And so, that was a positive first step. It's something that they know they can achieve, and they provided funding for it. The other thing they did was saying, well, how can we engage people in this success, even though you can say, well, it's quite a contrived success. And so they created this CFC-free certification for the different sites around the world, the cocoa sites around the world. And basically, as the different sites achieved the CFC-free status, they had an event for the employees at that site, which gave them an opportunity to celebrate, to sort of reward people who've been involved in it, but also as a point of education and recruiting people into the initiative. Because one of the things that really people get behind an initiative is if it's seen to be successful and supported by the leadership. So this is just an example of the types of activities that you can add into a sustainability initiative and use Egeria to track and maintain information about, in order to bring more people into the engagement. Okay, so we are heading towards the summary now. So we've talked a lot about the mechanisms around actually calculating and finding out where you are in your sustainability journey, and just getting yourself an initial set of figures in order to in order to start sort of pinpointing what needs to change. And behind the scenes, Egeria is acting as this knowledge graph, allowing knowledge from different parts of the organization to be brought together and linked together and used to sort of inform the next phase. We've talked about a variety of different types of mechanisms that can be supported by the knowledge graph as part of as part of Egeria's capability, and also how that sharing of knowledge helps with collaboration and feedback, knowledge building, community building, and ultimately process improvement. Now, this session, as I said, has been somewhat theoretical. We've covered the regulation, we've covered the types of activity that the organisation is involved in. And we'd like to come back and do a part 2 where we're going to walk through each of these phases, the mission, setting up, surveying, building and reviewing and planning, and show what's going on behind the scenes with Egeria, what's being captured, how it's used, how the information from an earlier stage is then used to springboard the next phase. And so hopefully you can actually see Egeria in action in part 2. Dan, anything more to add?
I think the main point is that Egeria is growing with you as you're building onto the knowledge graph, and it's a continuously learning process that is engaging with people as well as with systems, which is really perfect in a sustainability initiative because you don't just do it once and be done. This is something that's going to go on year after year, and we'll have more and more requirements. And so it's an incremental building process when we're trying to do a sustainability journey. And Egeria really supports that kind of an incremental development and ongoing program. And so they're very well suited for each other.